Hello, my name's Jacob Glazner, and this is my audience. And I'm going to be giving you all an informative speech on the aviation industry. So, 80% of the population said that they would rather fly than drive, depending on where they're going. Because most people aren't going to drive 14 hours to go one way when they could take a flight 3 hours to get there instead of driving 14. So the FAA, which is the Federal Aviation Administration, which basically governs all flights and anything that flies, they stated that in 2019 there were 925.5 million passengers that flew on airlines. There are only 100,863 commercial pilots to fly the airlines. So right there is a huge gap between passengers and pilots that can transport them from point A to point B. Really, the purpose of this speech is to share my knowledge and provide a little bit of insight into the aviation industry and what it takes to become a pilot. So, my first point is requirements to becoming a pilot. So, according to the FAR-AIM, which is our regulation book, it states that you have to have 40 plus hours to get your private pilot license. So that usually takes around 6 months if you're flying 3 to 5 days a week. It'll take you about 6 months. Now for the private pilot, you're only able to fly from point A to point B with a couple of friends. You can't fly for hire and you can't fly in bad weather. So right there, you have to fly on perfect days and you're going literally from point A to point B. Now, for your instrument rating, it's just an add-on to your private pilot license. That takes about 6 months too, but it only requires 35 hours of flight time to be able to take the test to see if you are proficient and are able to fly correctly in instrument conditions. So, there are only, according to BTS.gov, they stated that there are only 161,000 pilots private pilots in the U.S. Now, there are only 47,000 of those pilots are instrument rated. So right there, they are there's a big gap in between private pilots and instrument rated pilots. Now, every pilot, they have to be able to read a VFR chart. How whenever you start your private pilot, you'll be able to understand this chart, but this is basically how you navigate whenever you first start. This is the only thing you're able to use. This is how you fly, this is how you know where you are, this is how you do everything. Now, getting on to my second point, the expenses to becoming a pilot. Now, off of personal experience, my private pilot license cost me $18,000, but that's with a degree. If you were to go without a degree and do this as a side thing, then it'll only take you about $12,000 to do. Now, getting a degree always helps in the long run. So if you're going for the airline industry, then getting a degree is the way to go because they will pick somebody with a degree over somebody that doesn't have a degree. And it's just the safer bet whenever you're trying to go for the airlines like I am. Now, I'm currently in my instrument rating process, and so far I've spent around $13,000, maybe $14,000, and I'm about to get my instrument rating. Normally, it'll cost about $9,000, $10,000 to get your instrument rating if you're not going for a degree. But since I'm going for a degree, it's going to cost me a little bit more. Now, once you get your instrument rating, as I stated before, you can fly for hire. You can fly from point A to point B and get paid to do it. So you can fly with a passenger that says, hey, I want to go to Louisiana. You can fly him to Louisiana and you can get paid for it. Now, coming on to my third and final point, the need for pilots in the US is like crazy. Everybody needs pilots. Airliners everywhere, they need pilots. According to WJLA.com, the FAA reported in 2017 that there were 609,000 pilots in the US. Now, that number is 30% down from 30 years ago. So 30 years ago, there were 827,000 commercial pilots in the US. There were tons. They were everywhere. But now the number has gone down so much. And as the shortage is really felt by every airline, just because they're right now paying people extra to stay. They're doing everything they can to get people in there to fly those aircrafts and meet the required times. Because as Business Insider stated, they said that they have raised the total required commercial flight hours up from around 700, 800 to about 1,250. So right there, that's an extra 3 to 4 months of training just to get into the commercial field. Now, also some of the reasons that there's been a decrease is because the flight hours have been raised. Most of the pilots that are there from the war, they have been there ever since they left the Army, and they have been flying the airline. So they're not to sound mean, but they're starting to get a little old and they're ready to retire. So they're trying to do everything they can to retire and get out of there, but the airlines are doing everything they can to keep them there and keep the planes moving. Another reason is because there are fewer pilots coming from the military. There are not as many pilots coming from the military, so the airliners really can't pick and choose who they want. Now whoever is there, they're trying to grab. And then finally, there's just really not a big interest in the airline industry anymore. Nobody wants to become a pilot because it costs so much to become a pilot. That's really what deteriorates like why people want to become pilots. But from personal experience, once you get up there during sunset, that is the best office view you can ever have. It's just beautiful. That's really all I can say about it. But this brings me to my conclusion that the aviation industry offers many different opportunities for a pilot, but to become a pilot, it will take time, it'll take some money, and it'll take a lot of patience, because it just takes time. It's like learning how to drive, but times 10 a little bit. It's a little bit harder than driving, but once you get to it, it's like riding a bike. Once you do it a couple times, you'll be fine. But really, even though it's going to be a little bit more money and it's going to take a little bit more patience and time, like whenever I get up to the commercial field and once I get there and I can fly for airlines, I've already had encounters with airline pilots that have changed people's days just because they talked about God, or they gave them a little advice, or they spread a little bit of the gospel, and it just brings people are able to spread their faith and be able to travel around the world and be able to talk about Christianity, because they can talk about the Lord whenever they're flying. Like, they can spread our faith just from going from point A to point B, and can change somebody's day because of it. And yeah, it's really just priceless seeing people's faces whenever you start talking about the gospel whenever you're flying around. Nobody really expects that from a pilot. But yeah, that's my informative speech, and I would like to thank y'all for listening to me.